Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Deep Cuts of Horror, your horror podcast that cuts deeper. My name's Dylan, and I'm joined again by my co-host Jacob. And today, we're talking about The Company of Wolves. And if you haven't heard of it, don't feel bad. This movie is so slept on that even the star falls asleep and sleeps through the whole thing. Jacob, what were your thoughts going into this movie? Did you see the trailer or anything beforehand?
No, I did not. I try always to watch basically nothing and read basically nothing about any of these films prior to watching them. So I had no idea what I was getting into. I knew that it was fantasy oriented because you had mentioned that ahead of time. And I knew that I loved the name. I kept calling it In the Company of Wolves, which
Uh-huh.
I still think is a better name. And maybe that's another movie, I don't know, but I was excited because it sounded fun.
Oh yeah. I had seen the trailer just because I was stitching some stuff together for the pod, and usually I do try to give trailers a chance whenever I'm sussing out what we're going to do for the season if I haven't heard of it, just to make sure that it's something that can be talked about. And so I was really excited about this from the trailer. It was real grainy, it was dark, and it reminded me of a type of fantasy that you don't get anymore. With 80s and 70s fantasy movies, they all felt very lived in. There was an uncanny nature to them, but that was part of the appeal of it. Now everything tries to be so hyper realistic, genuine, that it almost degrades the fantasy element a little bit. What would you say to that, Jacob?
Yeah, so I'm going to enter into a mode where I know some people are going to call it pretentious, but it's not. It's just my honest opinion. And this may just be caused by the era of film that we had when we were children. But I think that uncanniness is extremely important to establishing the fantasy setting. Because when I see a lot of movies nowadays, it doesn't matter if the CGI is good or bad. And in fact, a lot of times when the CGI is good, it's even worse for the film overall. Because no matter how well it's done, I know that it's not there. I know that this is just some computer imitation of a thing. Whereas when you have this elaborate, dark, foggy set and puppets everywhere, like you have in The Company of Wolves, those things are real. They're really there, but they have this uncanniness to them where it's like there's something not quite right about that.
Yeah, and you're reminded that this is again a fantasy, so things can be a little not real.
Yeah, and I think the crux of it is this. When you try to imitate reality, you can fail. When you create your own reality, you cannot fail. So if it looks to me like you're trying to be some perfect replica of a real thing in this world, I'm never going to buy it. If you just make some awful makeup or puppet practical effect, I'm going to buy it because it's your world, not ours.
I really enjoy these movies that do this, and watching it just made me miss those days of having those fantasy movies, and I'm so glad this movie scratched that itch to me, because you can tell watching it that this is a set, but it feels like a set that I would really love to explore. And the characters in it feel like they belong in this set much the same way characters in a fairy tale belong in their story. They don't exist outside of it, they just perform their functions, and I just thought that was really creative and wonderful.
And the set feels so intimate. Like they're in this sort of dark forest area for most of the film, if not the entire film, apart from the bookends. And it's kind of claustrophobic. You feel like everywhere you turn, there's going to be a bunch of rocks and trees and cliffs and snakes curled up in the trees, and like there's really no wide open spaces. And I think that makes the world feel even bigger because you can constantly imagine what's just around the corner. This is way before we can ever get any wide panning shots where we're flying over trees or anything like that. It's just like you said, is a set. and it's a set that looks like it's full of things to explore.
It's funny you were talking about thinking about animals coming in and out of sets because my whole time I was thinking about Fraggles. For some reason, I've had Fraggles on the brain, and I've just been thinking about the set. You can tell it's a miniature, and it would not be out of place if a Fraggle were to just pop out
You know what else this entire film reminded me of?
into the woods if it were made in the 80s.
Well, that is a good answer, but no. This reminded me of The Babe.
What, babe?
The Babe from Labyrinth, Dylan, because I'm not going to do that whole thing.
Didn't
that
take
would
the bait.
not gonna take the bait. No, but you took the bait, but I'm gonna shut that one down. But seriously, I feel like once I got past the first 15 minutes of this movie, which is how long it took me to figure out what the hell was going on, I was like, this reminds me of some kind of alternate universe Labyrinth. It follows the same story where you have a sort of young to teenage girl going through this dark
Exploration
fantasy
of her
themed,
sexuality.
yeah, this dark fantasy themed sexual exploration with and a handsome androgynous man at the end. It really, really gave me those vibes, even from the beginning. Like I said, even though I didn't know what was going on at the time, where you have this fantasy film that is clearly set in the quote unquote modern day, and you have people walking around in white dresses and driving cars. It feels like these could have been made by the same people, honestly.
I'm actually surprised Henson had nothing to do with this because usually there's some Henson somebody doing something. And for what it's worth, I feel like the practical effects really were pretty decent. At the time, you had a lot of werewolf themed movies coming out, and it just seemed like they were all trying to one up each other in terms of special effects. You got to think about movies like An American Werewolf in London. Yeah, that one. An American Werewolf in London. It was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Practical Effects. And ever since then, werewolf movies have kind of tried to just like one up each other. And I think that's pretty interesting. Now, as for the movie overall, Jacob, what if you had one word to describe this movie, what would it be?
Well, I'm going to answer that, but first I'm going to comment on your special effects aside because the first moment in this movie where I really properly started paying attention and appreciating it was the transformation scene from the first story with the husband and the bride when this guy starts tearing off his face and you just see blood and muscle and sinew underneath, and then he's just walking around like this anatomy model, and then he turns lupine, and then hair starts sprouting. I think that showing someone this film for that scene alone might be worth it. They went so far out of their way to create that transformation scene, and they did it in such a way where I don't think that I would have ever thought to make werewolves transform that way. Like normally they just grow hair.
Yeah, and you cut this scene. If you cut this scene out, up until this point in this movie could have been PG.
But as far as one word to describe it, I know this might be disappointing because I think this film has a whole lot to offer. But if I had to pick one word, I would say sexual. Like this is an extremely sexual film.
Yeah, I mean, oh yeah, it's very sexual. Anything to do with teenagers and werewolves is gonna be sexual, just because there's a lot of commonality in the themes there with the changing and even body hair. God, and just the way they make these werewolves in this movie, particular, very uh, seductive, for lack of a better word. But my one word would be, and I know it's a hyphen word, but dreamlike. Just because the further removed I am away from it, the more it feels like my own dream. There are little segmented stories in this that just kind of, I'll be honest, they do kind of take me out of the movie as I was watching it. But looking back on it, it feels like a dream I had where you just kind of, when you're sleeping, you weave in and out from one dream to another, and then suddenly you come back to like the main dream. And it's when you wake up, you think about, oh, wait, no, that wasn't related. It's just The more muddled it gets in your brain, the better it is.
And that's definitely intentional. And that's one of the reasons I was disappointed that I had to say sexual, because my favorite part of this was how dreamlike it was. And that's why it's bookended with the main character simply sleeping. Like we start the film with this character just being asleep in a bed, and then we end with the character being asleep on a bed and wolves coming for her. And that helps to justify the extremely loose narrative where we weave in and out of those stories, like you said.
No, I think it was very smart too, because if you were going to tell a fairy tale wolf anthology, I don't think it would go as well. But having these stories weave in and out, it forms a multi purpose in what it's doing. One, you have that dream nature where you're constantly switching between different narratives, and none of them are really, they're all very emotionally driven. They don't make much sense other than being fables, but they also function as a oral tradition story as well. Whereas you have this little tight knit group in this village and they're telling these stories, and it makes sense that they would because this is their oral tradition. So it makes sense on that level. It makes sense on a level of, you're having this stream and weaving in and out of the narratives. It's just something I enjoyed. It was like uh, the oral tradition stories that the Grimm's fairy tales were based on. Or, for us, it would probably be more like a Are You Afraid of, not Are You Afraid of the Dark, scary stories to tell in the dark.
I'm gonna go on a sort of shower thoughts, again, maybe pseudo pretentious kind of analysis here, but I want to know how you feel about it, because there's a really, really specific ambience that I feel like this movie creates that I don't see very often, and I really love it every time I see it. We're talking about it being dreamlike, and it absolutely is, but there's something not quite dreamlike. It's something else. It almost feels to me like the setting of this film takes place in the space between human life and whatever exists beyond it, in sort of the same way that Over the Garden Wall did, with the unknown. Like, this is sort of a vignette that tries to compile lived human experience, because you have just this tiny village where people are doing basic tasks to survive in a dark forest. Everything is very sexual. There's a focus on the dangers of the woods and not straying from the path. There's animals everywhere. The coloration, like, no matter what time of day it is, it's basically always this odd burnt orange color. It almost feels to me like this is some kind of different dimension purgatory where people are just living as humans. And I'm not saying that as some kind of film theory. I'm just talking about the feeling that it created.
Yeah, and I definitely think that was intentional. I don't really think it's on necessarily a different dimensional plane. I think the movie plays very heavily with your different stages of sleep, right? Because you have this almost Alice in Wonderland falling down the rabbit hole entrance into this story, with her going through these larger than life characters that are in her bedroom that are now all blown up, which are creepy as shit, by the way. You have this doll that looks like the infamous haunted Robert doll in her room, and then in her dream, it is fully life size and it is attacking this person. And then you have this weird pan flute playing China doll. China, in more than one reason, unfortunately.
That
Um,
sounded like a slur. You
but
pan flute playing China doll.
porcelain doll is what I meant, as in a form of China itself. But anyway, that's in the dream, and it reminds me of the episode The Twilight Zone where the boy could turn people into the corn and made that one person a giant Jack in the Box head, which scared the hell out of me as a kid.
I was reminded of the exact same thing. I think it's great that we both thought of that.
And I feel like it was an intentional callback to something like that, because you can't be that influential and not draw from it. But again, it's very childlike, it's very whimsical, very dreamlike. And then the further in you get, the more emotionally driven the story is. And it's definitely not a movie that you can think about logically. It's definitely a movie that you just have to sit back and just let things happen like they would in a dream. And to your point, with all these characters in the town, it's a lot like the, for lack of a better term, non playable characters that you have in a dream, who just move around in the background, and they're not doing anything necessarily odd. They're just performing whatever function that person would in that society in your brain. Almost like if you went up to them and told them it's a dream, they do what people in your dreams do and start attacking you.
Well, they are set pieces, and it's completely fine that they're set pieces. Like I think it's almost charming that they exist to serve just this one purpose of existing. And you mentioned earlier about the oral tradition. I think that also helps to make it feel like a dream or like some compilation of human experience, because that's how we told stories for so long, is you would pass your wisdom on from parent to child, to from community to the new members of the community. And the sorts of things that they're talking about in these fables are like what sorts of men to be afraid of, don't stray from the path, don't eat a windfall apple. I love that one. It's so sort of literal and yet cryptic at the same time. It's like trying to impart the wisdom of the world onto this character of, is it Rosaline? Rosalind? How is it pronounced?
Rosaline. So like Rosalie, but with an N, like Jolene.
You messed up my monologue by causing me to sing Jolene inside my head. I'll have to pass the torch to you for now.
Like I said, I love the rules in this story. Never eat a windfallen apple. Never trust a man whose eyebrows meet in the middle. It just sounds important, but at the same time sounds like something you would hear in a dream that makes no real sense. But you just follow the logic, like Rosaline does, and I just love it. And I love the time of day this takes place in, where everything is, if Gotham is a rainy night at 11 p.m. in New York, this is definitely a mid October afternoon.
Sorry, I was thinking about the cryptic advice, and you are absolutely right. That is the kind of thing you'd hear in a dream, and that sort of thing happens to me all the time. Like, let's say that I had some meeting that was coming up in the next couple days, and I was kind of nervous about it. I can imagine myself having a dream where my grandmother is telling me, "Don't trust a man whose eyebrows meet." And then I'm going to wake up super anxious about that meeting because the dude's eyebrows meet. And I'm like, okay, this my dream was trying to tell me something. Or like if I had a dream and you like confided in me, like, "Hey, Jacob, this whole podcast thing is so I can launder money. Don't tell anybody." Like, I would actually carry that into my daily life and be like, "Oh shit, something's going on, isn't it?"
Now, time for the ad break. Just kidding, we don't have one of those intentionally.
We don't have breaks either.
Nope, we're just recording these all in a long ass sequence. But anyway, maybe we should go into a little synopsis for this movie before we go any further. We're about 20 minutes in right now.
Good
Um,
luck.
yeah, so basically, this is going to be a very short description of the movie. We have a girl who falls asleep, and this whole movie is essentially a dream within a dream within a dream within a dream. And it all revolves around wolves and a pseudo Little Red Riding Hood narrative. That's the best I can place it without getting into a very terrible dream discussion. And I want to preface also say I enjoy hearing about people's dreams, but sometimes it gets obnoxious, and unfortunately, I'm not as invested in your dream as you are. I don't want to hear, I woke up and I got in this house, but the house was our other house, and you were working as a baker. Can you imagine that? And I'm telling you, I'm looking for the gun to put myself out of my misery when I hear those kind of dreams.
Are you trying to tell me something?
No, I enjoy hearing dreams. It's just I hear a lot of dreams. Unfortunately, I have too many people in my group who think they have prophetic visions in their dreams. And so I get to hear these dreams and then very narrowly explained version of what it means.
And what does this have to do with the Company of Wolves?
That this is all a dream explanation. But I will go ahead and say one of my favorite things in this is how things wrap up and explain away themselves much the same way dreams do, which is very illogically, but you just kind of shrug your shoulders and go with it. Like if someone's head is taken off, it just crashes like porcelain into the wall, and that's just it.
I like that even Wikipedia has trouble summarizing this film. Like they have to split it into two sections. Section 1 just tells the chronological story of what's happening with Rosaline, and then section 2 splits up the dreams into subsections and like the fables within the dream into subsections. Because I'll be completely transparent here. After I watched this, I had to go and kind of look up an outline to try to figure out that I understood it properly.
I mean, I think it was mostly understood. I followed it through, but honestly, I'm enjoying it a lot more talking about it in retrospect than I did actually watching it, just because it's all blended together much the same way a dream would. Only this is a dream you can keep revisiting.
And I love how obvious the morals of each fable within the dream are, to the point where it doesn't come off like the story is supposed to have a moral. It just comes off as though this is what the story is about. Like, yes, this is the story about not trusting a man whose eyebrows meet. This is the story about not straying from the path or whatnot. I mean, the overtones are so explicit that they go past being preachy and they just feel like, yeah, this is what the story's about. And I like that.
Oh, yes. Did you have any favorite characters in this?
The werewolf gentleman at the very end was fun. I liked him quite a lot. I loved the grandmother. I was sad when she died. And weirdly enough, despite the fact that she has very little character, I really liked Rosaline just because she goes with it. Like she's just existing in this weird dream world with werewolves and people hitting on her and her grandmother's head being smashed against the wall and shattering like a china doll. But she just kind of goes with the flow and accepts everything, and there's something charming about that.
Oh, yes, and the story is also, I know we talked about it being sexual, but it's also dripping with just intimacy, period. And part of that is because this takes place on a set that is all real and tangible. And it just makes the story itself, when you have two characters, regardless of what it is, seem very intimate, which creates a lot of discussion that can be had on the different types of intimacy. Toward the end, we get the sexual intimacy between Rosaline and the gentleman. And then we also have just this other intimacy between her and her friend, the he's not really given a name, but the boy, and he's a huge jackass. I can't stand him. He was very annoying. You also have this like familiar intimacy whenever she's talking to her mom about things and kind of trying to understand womanhood, and the really weird scene where she sees her mom and her dad doing it. Ugh.
Okay, so firstly, the boy, if you watch this with captions, he is referred to as Amorous Boy, which I think is hilarious that you would just name a character Amorous Boy. But secondly, how is he a jackass? Like, he asks to go on a walk with her in the woods. The gentleman at the end, like, ambushes her in the woods, starts like making advances on her just like the amorous boy, and then kills her grandmother.
I love that his name is Amorous Boy, but at the same time, he was just a bit too much of a clown. He was always really trying to get her to leave the path and just walk in the woods, and just really, he had zero riz. I'm sorry. Just something about him. Didn't like him. And
Yeah, you
also,
just don't like him because he wasn't hot, like the David Bowie knockoff at the end, who
mm,
killed her grandmother.
that, and there's something to be said about a character who also says another character's name way too many times. I didn't do an official count, but he says Rosaline's name pretty much prefacing every sentence he says regarding her. There are several characters in television that do this, especially in the 80s for some reason. I guess I thought we'd forget characters' names. I'm the same way with the mom in Poltergeist. She says Carol Ann way too much, to the point of ad nauseum. Oh, and the weird little skin crawler thing in the Mortal Engines, if you ever watched that turd of a film.
Have you ever met anyone in real life that does that?
Have seen the Mortal Engines? No, it was awful.
Who says people's names way too often, Dylan?
I don't think so, unless it's in regard to you're in a group and you're just trying to get one person's attention. And that's where the issue comes in. With this movie being so intimate, it's usually just one on one conversation. So there's no need to say that one person's name way too many times.
I get sort of unnecessarily aggroed, I guess. I hate having to use that word in a legitimate conversation, but when somebody says my name, it like triggers me. It's like you hear, like, if you know the true name of a thing, you have power over it. If somebody just says, Jacob, how are you? I like, my hair stands up and I'm like, how dare you use the name?
I mean, you have, like, if it's just me and you talking, there's no need for you to use my name and then you to use your name, unless we're, recording a podcast, because this is a audio medium and it's important that people who are tuning in know our names. That way they can put something to the voices. But if it's just a one-on-one conversation, there's no need for it. And also maybe that's one of the reasons I'm not too big on anime. I've really tried to like it. Folks, don't come at me. They overuse people's names so many times, and they follow a very soap opera format. Not to get on too much of a tangent, they follow a soap opera format where you'll tune in for 30 minutes and only like 10 minutes of stuff will actually have happened. And then you're waiting for, say, this event that's going to go down, this real big event that's going to go down on Tuesday, but it takes 100 episodes to get to Tuesday. Much like in soap operas, it takes 400 episodes to get to a wedding that's supposed to happen next week.
Never stray too far from the path, Dylan.
Well, I do.
No. So just so that we don't move too far away from the company of wolves, we just need to clarify that Dylan is racist against Asian cultures,
Yes.
which is why he doesn't like anime and why he has a problem with China dolls.
Porcelain figurines. It's 2023.
My apologies. Asian American porcelain figurines.
I don't think they're really American. I think they're British. There's British license plates on the vehicles.
It's not particularly important, I guess, but I am curious. Yeah, is this supposed to be in America or Britain? Because I don't even remember if the characters have accents or not.
Oh, yeah, they do, because remember the first scene, and again, another annoying character, the main character, I guess, because she's not really given a name in the real world outside the dream, so I don't know if it's her actual name.
We should
But
probably just assume it's Rosaline, right?
okay, well, the real Rosaline, the Rosaline that is dreaming everything, her sister is trying to get her up and just says the word pest over and over and over again. Like that's some sort of swear.
Yes, and clearly if it were in America, she would have been saying varmint.
She has it with a British accent, and pest is very much a word that you wouldn't. I don't know, an Americanized version of that. I feel like maybe it's because I don't know if the director is American or there's just some sort of viewpoint that we're not seeing here that isn't necessarily British. I feel like an American person would just maybe call their sibling something nasty like a little shit or something along those lines instead of just a pest. Which again leads to my thing of without the gory special effects of the wolves, this movie could have been PG.
What was it rated in the end? I didn't actually check.
Rated R.
I'm not sure that's warranted. I mean, yeah, the special effects are a bit disturbing, but
Well, at the time you didn't have PG 13.
oh, okay. So it was either PG or R.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't
Well,
even. Yeah, well, you had G then.
well, yeah. I knew you had G, but that's not really relevant. This movie is not G. Yeah, it's good that we have PG-13 because this does sit in an awkward space between I definitely disagree with R and I would definitely disagree with PG. So I guess it's a shame because it feels more like a children's movie to me than it would a horror film.
Again, well, there's also a scene in the first Poltergeist where a man rips his own skin off and reveals the flesh underneath, and it's real gruesome, and the Poltergeist is rated PG.
If I launch into a tirade about arbitrary standards for what's acceptable viewing, then I think it'll derail the conversation. But the more that I think about this, the more I can't really see anything in it that would justify an R rating. even the werewolf transformation scene, as potentially disturbing as it is, isn't really anything that I wouldn't trust a child to watch. Like, I think that it's perfectly fine. I mean, and yeah, there is the sexual stuff, but even that wasn't visually explicit. It was just tonally explicit.
It definitely is a PG-13, but then I feel they would have cut the gore scenes a bit still if it were PG-13, because something about the live action effects versus, say, if you just do it CGI, you just miss something there. And I just feel like the effects look a lot more gnarly when they are practical effects.
Oh yeah, I don't really know how much more I can say on the subject, but the entire time that guy is ripping his skin off and I'm watching the layers underneath, I'm sort of imagining what it would be like if I were him and I were ripping my skin off, and that's what my eyes looked like and my teeth. And it just, it's so much more visceral and so much more real than anything that I've seen like in the past decade.
Just a little side point. This movie also had me thinking about what would I, if I lived back in old timey times, back when we worried about wolves, would I be so concerned about peeing outside, or would I just use a chamber pot? And I think for sanitary reasons, I would still probably piss outside.
I was wondering how you were going to work piss into this episode, and I agree with you. I really don't want a pot full of waste sitting in my room. Although I expect people were rather accustomed to bad smells. The idea that nobody bathed and everybody smelled like shit is a bit apocryphal. People had noses, but still, you were on farms, you had manure, you had body odor. So I suppose having a chamber pot would probably not be that big a deal, but I definitely prefer to keep things clean and sweet smelling when I can.
Oh yeah, and especially not right by the bed. I don't know. And like they show flies gathering around it, so I thought that was pretty gnarly. And I love the connotation like Grandma has that. Oh, he just peed outside because he was shy. It just kind of reminded me how um sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, I'm not getting it back.
That's fine because for once we can finally have a podcast episode that mirrors the narrative style of the film we're reviewing, which is to say that it weaves in and out of topics with no direction whatsoever and has an unsatisfying ending.
So, which one of the little vignettes did you prefer the most? We'll talk about the main. We'll call it the Little Red Riding Hood story. We'll reserve that. But as far as the vignettes inside of the story, which one did you prefer?
The first one, no contest, which is the story of this young woman who meets a traveling man whose eyebrows meet in the middle. Oh, the ghastly unibrow. They get married, and then he wanders off at night, ostensibly. He doesn't actually claim he's going to pee. He calls it the call of nature, and she assumes that means he's using the bathroom when, of course, in reality, he's a werewolf. And then she doesn't see him again for many, many years. She finds another husband. She has 2 or 3 children. And then he comes back looking all disheveled, gets mad that she was unfaithful, and turns into a werewolf. And then he gets killed in a very unsatisfying manner, to be frank. His head just kind of flies off, which is something that happens multiple times in this film, weirdly.
Into like a barrel of milk?
Yeah, a barrel of something. I assume that it was milk.
Well, I mean, if he's keeping his pee in a bucket, you can assume he might be keeping other things in there as well.
Despite the fact that I love the loose narrative structure that weaves in and out of stories, I will say that I wasn't a huge fan of any of the other three. Like, I really, really liked this first one. I think it was very uh, sort of dramatic. It had a nice feeling of mystery and fantasy to it. The second one, where the bastard meets the devil who's driving a Rolls Royce, like the anachronism and the surreality aside, that story didn't go anywhere. He just started growing hair on his chest, and then vines came up, and that was it. Like, what the hell was even the point of that story?
Yeah, I mean the only thing I enjoyed about that, and I don't want to. downplay what I enjoyed about it, but I love this sort of primitive era and this setting, and then a Rolls Royce rolls up, and that's clearly the car of the devil. I just I just enjoy seeing stuff like that where the dark figure is driving something that is miles beyond the technology that these primitive people currently have. But yeah, he starts growing hair on his chest. Was he supposed to turn into a wolf, or did just meeting the devil accelerate puberty? And if so, is shining the devil's car just a euphemism for his puberty and masturbating?
I don't know, maybe I missed something, but I just couldn't find any logic in here. So the idea is that that young boy was the bastard child of a priest, and apparently all children of priests go and meet the devil in the woods at some point. And the devil, again, he pulls up in a Rolls Royce and gives the young boy a potion, which it is implied the boy wanted from the devil. He puts it on his chest. He starts to grow hair, but then like vines come up and start trapping him, and he screams. And yeah, I thought he was going to turn into a werewolf too, but he doesn't. And I don't know why he wanted the potion in the first place. It kind of seems like he just wanted some chest hair. Like this one, maybe I'm missing something obvious, but this one just didn't have a lot of meaning for me. And in terms of the devil rolling up in a Rolls Royce, it absolutely works. But thematically, there has to be a cap on this, right? Like, we're looking at some sort of fictional medieval era, and he rolls up in a car. So let's say we had a story that was set in the modern day today. Does the devil roll up in a TIE fighter? Like, how does that work? That wouldn't work anywhere near as well, right?
I don't think so, but then again, we don't know what the vehicle of the future is. So we don't really have a frame of reference for that.
Yeah, I guess if it really was like 50, 100 years in the future and they made another movie like this set in the early 2000s, that you could probably still do this.
I mean, you could do it in the 80s and have the devil roll up in a Tesla. I feel like that would be similar.
The Devil Drives a Tesla. That sounds like an excellent book title.
I don't know, I just really enjoyed that. And to this movie's credit, even in the vignettes that aren't so good, there is some very impressive cinematography. Just in the shots they grab, uh, is very artistic, and there are so many still grabs from this movie that you could honestly frame as a picture or put in a storybook by itself.
How did you feel about the last two vignettes, the ones we haven't talked about yet?
So I did enjoy the one where the woman cursed the aristocratic party. I like that. I liked seeing the party just turn into wolves. And if you're a fan of body horror, this movie has it for you, as with pretty much any werewolf movie. I'm not too big on it, but I can do werewolf transformation stuff. I just enjoyed it, and the kind of metaphor that at this point in time the bourgeoisie was very primal and very destructive and stuck together much like a pack of wolves would.
And then what about the last one, which was, I guess, probably the least impactful just because of how obvious the allegory was? But you have the lone wolf wandering into the town.
I You know what, I enjoyed that. Maybe it was the that one was more you have more of a narration throughout, but I like the idea of the wolf coming up from hell and then going back. Maybe it was just the visual medium. I feel like I would have enjoyed seeing this in maybe a kind of shadow puppet style. I feel like that would have really amped up the creep factor. But for what it's worth, it being more of a visual story than like you're supposed to draw something away from the story, I enjoyed it.
Something about the way they did the costuming on the girl version of the wolf kind of put me off. I'm not sure what it was, but she looked really really strange. Which I think she's actually the only female werewolf that we see in the film, isn't she?
Well, I mean, we see a bunch of wolves, period. So we don't really. I'd say, I mean, canonically, as far as the story goes, I would say yeah. She's the only one we see besides the character at the end of the movie. But In actuality, I think most of them were girl wolves because they're just easier to train. But a fun fact on this movie is they had to have a sniper on set full time because no wolf can actually be trained 100%. They're as a species, they're known very often to just kind of go with it and then strike when people think that they're most susceptible, which is an interesting fact about wolves.
Can you imagine being on the set and knowing that you have specifically hired a sniper to make sure that wolves don't attack people?
Because they're just faking being trained.
That is, I mean, I'm taking your word for it that all of that is true because I haven't looked into it, but that is terrifying. I cannot imagine being one of like the actors trying to film a scene, knowing that there's a damn guy with his reticule trained on the wolves just in case they try to eat my ass.
I don't think that's what they were going to eat. I don't know. I just found it very scary, especially with as many movies as I've seen with wolves, knowing that fact that they'll just fake being trained, which makes me wonder. We have a lot of scenes in the movie from far away where they're running and doing stuff, and I could almost swear that they weren't actual wolves. I think they were just breeds of dogs that look similar to wolves. I know at the end, well, at the bookended segment of the movie, we have, I'm like 99% sure it's a German Shepherd that is chasing the car, and then a German Shepherd comes through the window.
Well, yeah, that's what I was about to ask you because we've been sitting here talking about wolves, but when I was actually watching it, most of them looked like dogs to me. I don't remember seeing anything that I thought was actually a wolf.
I think for the scenes where we had one on ones, I believe those were actual wolves, but for the most part, they were like when they were in packs, they were dogs because wolves are most likely to act out as a pack. It's a whole numbers thing, and apparently they understand numbers very well. So they would just have the individual ones for the individual scenes where there was just a lone wolf. That was the one they would have to train the sniper for. And then for the pack things, of course, they keep it enough in the shadows that you can't really tell. But I'm 90% sure they were dogs.
Yeah, but like, how does that even work? Because let's say that it was a wolf in the scene at the end when Rosaline is petting him and he's wounded. Which again, I'm not convinced that it was. It still kind of looked like a dog to me, but I'm pretty ignorant on the subject overall. So let's say that it's a wolf. The wolf goes rogue and starts attacking her. Now the sniper's got to shoot the wolf, right? But he's on top of the girl.
He has to shoot both of them because if she's bitten, she will become one.
Oh, so you're telling me they got real werewolves to play in this film?
All wolves are werewolves?
Where?
Wolves.
No, not what.
Where?
It's a serious question though.
How so?
Is the sniper like so well positioned and so well trained that he can shoot the wolf off of the girl with such a degree of confidence that she won't be hurt? Otherwise, you would have to be terrified as the actor in that position.
Jacob, this was an indie production in the 80s. People didn't think about things like this.
The guy with the gun had to have, or at least the guy that hired him.
Okay, but listen to me when I pitch this for you. We're making a movie about werewolves. We're gonna have real wolves. What assurances are we gonna have? We're gonna have a sniper with a gun on set just in case shit goes south.
Well, a sniper without a gun is pretty fucking useless.
Well, yeah, but you see where I'm going with this, where the business model of this just is one and one is equaling five somehow.
I don't know. It just seems like more of a horror story than the actual film.
And again, I don't believe PETA was too involved then, so it's always kind of sad watching movies from this time, and thinking about kind of how animals could have been treated, like especially when movies get black and white. Especially, animals weren't treated well. Like I was watching the original Invisible Man, and there's a scene where a cat gets hit with hot tar. Um, Now, I don't think it was hot tar, but it was definitely lead based paint because that movie was made in like 38. And I'm just like, oh, poor kitty.
Which is just such a shame because there are so many good films that have come out of that entire span. And like having to go back and imagine the sorts of terrible things that might have happened on the set, it just kind of takes some of the fun away from it. And maybe it should take some of the fun away from it, but I don't know. It's kind of frustrating.
Yeah, not to focus on too much, but one of my favorite movies is Milo and Otis as a kid. If you reading up on that movie, I cannot watch that. I cannot watch it anymore just because it was made over 7 years and they went through like 7 cats. One and like they were just throwing them over cliffs to get shots.
Oh my god.
And it made it into the film because there's a whole scene where like the what is it a cat is running away from something and accidentally jumps off a cliff, and yeah, they just filmed a cat going off a cliff into like a rocky seaside.
What a way to ruin someone's childhood.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate, and I hate that I watched it so much because damn. It's a real downer, and the movie itself always had this vibe of being a bit of a downer. Um, but I never really gave it much thought, other than like the themes in the movie being the life of a cat and a dog that are best friends, and then they're separated, then they come back together at different parts of their lives. But just the trauma. But anyway, back to whatever this movie is. Maybe we should talk about the Little Red Riding Hood narrative, which is something I really enjoyed out of this. Um, Unlike most that try to reinvent the wheel, it was kind of comforting to see a story that, for the most part, kind of adds to but doesn't take away from the story of Little Red Riding Hood.
I don't know what this says about me, but it took me maybe 30% of the film before I even acknowledged that this was a Little Red Riding Hood story. I don't know why that is. It's really obvious in hindsight. But I was just more focused on everything else that was going on. And then when I realized that it was a Little Red Riding Hood story, I got really sad because I knew the grandmother was going to die and I really liked her. It doesn't, pun intended, stray too far from the path of the original story, like you said. But it does put that interesting twist on it where she eventually sympathizes with the wolf and runs away with him, which is sort of like a really awkward, dreamlike coming of age story, I suppose. I don't know why you had to make the grandmother's head porcelain for that.
I mean, not the grandmother's head being porcelain thing, but it speaks to kind of this generational struggle of you have these adult figures telling the children, "Hey, you shouldn't do this," especially the grandmother figures. Um, well, I guess the oldest generation, they'll strictly tell you that you shouldn't do something. This is what you need to do. And then you get to the parents and they're like, yeah, you shouldn't do it. Like they say you shouldn't do it, but they're a little bit more wishy washy about it. And they're not as firm on the stance and beliefs and the systems in place to protect against such things. And then ultimately the child ends up doing it because it's their decision to do. I found that sort of thought process very very intriguing, as it were, especially with the sexual elements of this.
Oh, I do too, and I loved it. It's just I've become so accustomed to media trying to push some kind of message. And the reality is that most artists, whether or not they know they're pushing a message, are because they have their own biases and experiences. I'm trying to sit here and figure out what the message is supposed to be, and I can't find one. And I'm totally happy for there not to be one, but I want to convince myself that that's true first. Because if the idea is that these sorts of stories that your grandmother and your parents have told you about what not to do, eventually you're going to grow up and be your own person and you have to experience them for yourself. It's like that's kind of a fine message, but also he killed your grandmother. So I understand symbolically that can just represent the death of her authority over your life, but like it was also literally she died, and maybe you shouldn't run off with the guy that killed your grandmother. You get what I'm trying to say? I'm not even sure that I do.
Yeah, I took it more as a death of ideology, really. As every generation comes in, the older generation's ideology becomes a bit more endangered and eventually extinct from what is known and becomes archaic. And the granddaughter character coming into her own, I read as more of a passing in the torch of ideologies. Whether for good or ill, this is what it's kind of come to. But there's also something about what older generations put on the younger generation. Like if you were so consumed with this idea of wolves grabbing you and wolves doing this, what you're not doing is you're not really warning people, especially impressionable people, against something. You're really just providing information to them. A lot like the DARE program did. You weren't warning kids not to do drugs, you were teaching kids, oh, you can melt down heroin into a spoon and inject it into your arm?
One thing that I do not want to go unsaid, which I greatly appreciate and respect about this movie, is how you can take such a completely irrational and incoherent string of events literally occurring and use them to create a completely rational and clear implied message. Like, take everything that happens at face value, and it's exactly like what we've been talking about for this whole episode, which is just a bunch of random nonsense dreams with things that we can't even properly understand. Again, like, why was the head thrown into a puddle of milk? Why was the grandmother's head smashed into porcelain? Why do the werewolves turn into skinless creatures? But the narrative of the loss of innocence and the coming of age and the sexual awakening and the passing of one generation to the next, that is all just extremely clear. And I think it's fascinating how clear that message can be conveyed by using somebody dreaming about Little Red Riding Hood. I, there's almost something legitimately magical there.
Well, in itself, the story of Little Red Riding Hood has been used to convey this loss of innocence story, and in much more graphic ways than this, surprisingly. I'm reminded of the original Broadway production of Into the Woods, where the costume of the wolf has a prosthetic penis on it. And I mean, it's just a interesting character design feature, but whenever you think about them dancing and skipping around together and that prosthetic penis is just kind of flopping around with him, it just kind of adds to this layer of a loss of innocence and the seduction of somebody who is trying to do you harm.
Well, yes, the entire symbolism within the fairy tale itself, and I'm not commenting on the original story because I've not actually read like the original story, but you have a young girl lost in the woods alone wearing bright red, red being a color associated with blood, which means it has multiple sexual associations, one of which being flushness. It really is just ripe, pun intended, for
Wait,
that kind
Jacob,
of
you
analysis. Yeah,
mean you mean red, the color of the things of which we do not speak?
I suppose so. Yes, the blood of
Br-
angry men as well.
Well, I was just wanting to bring it back to The Village, our favorite M Night Shyamalan movie.
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't know if it beats the Last Airbender.
I don't know. I just love referring to the color red as the color of the people of which we do not speak.
And but then using fairy tales in that way to reference these types of ideas, that once again reinforces this feeling of it being some kind of collective human understanding of the world, because these are the stories that we all go back to, at least those of us that share a similar cultural background. And if you have a different cultural background, you're going to have your own stories. Like, you just have these ideas and themes and characters that are passed down across sometimes thousands of years and somehow manage to retain their iconic and symbolic natures.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how these simple stories evolve but don't really change their meaning. Um, like Little Red Riding Hood, she's on her way to grandmother's house with a basket of goodies because she doesn't feel well. Um, and she meets the wolf, tells the wolf where she's going. That is, you could basically equate that to the modern day of getting doxxed because the werewolf shows up at the place, eats grandma, then eats Little Red Riding Hood. Um, so it's very interesting how the story stays the same, but the relevance doesn't. Well, the relevance doesn't go away. Another thing I'd like to note is that in the end of the story, a woodsman comes around and just like hacks open the wolf, which is weird because this is the woods. There really shouldn't be that many people there. So it begs the question, what is a woodsman doing at an old lady's house with an axe? Just barging in and just goes immediately to cutting something open that is still dressed enough like Granny and convincingly looks enough like her to convince a child to go on a whole dialogue stream of, oh my, what big eyes you have, what big ears you have, what big teeth you have.
Once upon a very long time ago, you asked how I felt about the use of the Little Red Riding story in this film, and that's sort of what we've been talking about. But to get back to answering that question explicitly, I really like the sort of impending feeling that you have when you adapt a story like this and you change it just a little bit. When you try to completely reinvent the wheel, as you said, then I think it loses its meaning entirely because why not just make a different story? But when you just put a slight twist on it, like this story did, you know what's coming. Like, okay, this little girl's wearing red. There's a wood full of wolves, and she's going to grandma's house. I know where this is heading, but you still have that uncertainty and that mystery of how will it be resolved this time? What exactly is going to happen? And waiting and watching for those slight differences makes it very engaging, I think.
Oh yeah, and to kind of piggyback off your point, we're so used to in the modern media stream of seeing reinventions of the wheel. And to your point also, it's like why not just make something completely different? If this is a, I don't know, a Jack and the Beanstalk story with a strong feminist edge, or whatever. It just kind of, why not tell your own story? Why does it have to be a piggyback off of this one? And and then you find out when watching it, oh, it really doesn't add anything to it. You're just kind of marketing this as such, hoping it gets more traction than it currently has.
Well, you cannot create fairy tales. I know that's a weird thing to say because obviously, at some point far back in our history, these tales were created by someone, but you can't just be some Hollywood producer or director and create a fairy tale. That does not work. For whatever bizarre acid trip of a reason, and maybe it's just because we heard these stories when we were kids, but not all of them, you hear, ah, yes, Hansel and Gretel were wandering through the woods and they found a house made of gingerbread. And your brain just says, yeah, that checks out. And when somebody tries to take something like that and fabricate it or modify it, it doesn't work. Like there's something deep inside of you that feels that it's wrong.
And I'd agree to that. And again, we think of them as fairy tales because that's what they are in our modern culture. But they all started out with as just folk tales, oral tradition stories, and every culture has those. And for my money, I'd say the Grimm's fairy tales are the most prolific out of those, just because they're just so widely known.
Yes, but even religious texts function in a very similar way. And I'm not going to comment on the correctness or incorrectness or anything like that. But when you have stories like the character of Jonah being swallowed up by a whale, which is similar to how Pinocchio gets swallowed up by a whale, uh, or Geppetto, perhaps I should say. But something about just the cultural artifacts themselves resonate with people in a way that a vast majority of stories don't. And I guess maybe that's a survivorship bias because if they didn't, they wouldn't have survived this long.
Well, everything pulls from everything pretty much. You have the religious texts, and there are some very not saying that anything's true or untrue, but there's definitely a lot of fantastical elements to pull from. That if you put that in a modern context, is it creates a very fun story, and I really like seeing these stories adapted and made to fit modern times because they are so kind of plug and play. Like I said, Little Red Riding Hood, you could tell now. Hansel and Gretel, we literally covered a movie on our first episode for season two, New Nightmare, that played on the themes of Hansel and Gretel. Um, so it's really neat to see these themes just replayed out. And of course, every year there's a new twist on Cinderella brought out.
See, I really don't feel like it needs to be given any kind of modern twist, though, because they are so inherently resonant. Like, I don't really get any satisfaction from watching Little Red Riding Hood take a Big Mac to Grandma's apartment. Like, you don't need that because the original story is already so relatable. It's kind of bizarre that the original stories are so relatable, but they are. And so I feel like moving them into a modern setting is kind of redundant. It takes away what makes them fantastic.
Well, you don't necessarily. My problem is whenever attention is called to it as a retelling of it. Like New Nightmare, you have to peel back some layers, but at the core, it's a Hansel and Gretel story. Pretty Woman is a Cinderella story. Uh, and it's pretty much like at the core, you have those stories, but they're just expounded upon instead of just directly rewritten and subverted for the sake of subversion and being rewritten.
So you mean taking the template of the story or the format of the story rather than doing a
Yes.
legitimate retelling. Okay, that makes sense. But yeah, when I see a legitimate retelling, it needs to retain that fantasy element. Like one of the vignettes in Trick or Treat is a Little Red Riding story. And I really appreciate that one because it was respectful and the Halloween elements made it retain that fantastic theme. So that really worked. I think seeing Red Riding Hood take a Big Mac to Grandma's apartment would not work.
All right, but one thing I want to add to before we leave this topic of conversation, I think it's really important to also note that all these stories that we're mentioning, Cinderella, Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel, and all the others, they're stories about interactions with strangers, and sort of being the fish out of water in this land of familiarity, and being in the woods. Really, anytime the woods is mentioned in a story is basically an allegory for great change. Whatever happens when this person leaves the woods, they are going to be forever changed, and that sort of happens in these stories. But in all of these grim fairy tales, for the most part, that are most popular, they involve some character going to the woods and being changed.
And that's yeah, that's really what makes it so relatable, and also because that's a necessary thing. Like your characters are constantly surrounded by people saying be careful of the woods, or don't go into the woods, or don't trust the people that you meet in the woods. And these things are all true, but they lead to this idea that you shouldn't go into the woods. But just like in the Candyman discussion, when I talked about going out and having these adventures, you have to do that. That's a fundamental part of the human experience. You have to go into the unknown, and you have to face it, and you have to bring something good back from it. And I think that is sort of encapsulated by these stories because they're preparing you.
Which, while we're on it, Candyman is sort of a Little Red Riding Hood story in itself because we have this character who goes to this unfamiliar territory, and what she meets there ends up changing her forever as well. So all I'm saying is, whether intentional or unintentional, these are themes and core values that us in human nature carry with us throughout culture, throughout time, throughout everything. These sort of themes just stay the same even if the characters and settings change.
So is there anything else that you wanted to talk about related to this film?
Mm, no, I would like to touch on the ending just a little bit. I was really surprised with the ending and how when the villagers show up for Rosaline, she has accepted the wolf, and we know this because she's wearing the necklace that her mother gave her. And I also really enjoy, just a little side note, I really enjoy the kind of descriptions of the wolf whenever they're talking about wolves that are slick on the inside or wolves that are hairy on the inside will drag you to hell with them. I just find that like a fascinating psychology of these characters.
Do you want to talk about that a bit more, maybe? I mean, what did that mean to you? Because if somebody hears, oh, a wolf that's hairy on the inside, that's a bit of a confusing statement to parse.
It's a confusing statement to listen to, but you just kind of come to understand that's what she means. That's the distinction between a regular wolf and a werewolf, which I guess comes from the fact that it's almost as though the wolves come out of their human body and kind of tear out through there, which is very interesting because it's almost like they're always inside and they just explode. And I think the thing with Rosaline that really um came together for her as a character was whenever she was told by the gentleman that he gets to live inside both worlds.
Yes, and the way that I ended up interpreting hairy on the inside was sort of more along the lines of a wolf in sheep's clothing, where a wolf that's hairy on the outside looks like a wolf. And you know that it's something that might be dangerous. But a wolf that's hairy on the inside would be maybe somebody that looks like a human, somebody that doesn't look like a wolf.
Yeah, that's a good one too. I took a little bit more literal approach from what was given to me. Um, Again, this is like analyzing a dream itself. Did you have anything to add about this end scene? All right. So are we ready to move on to the end? Wrap it up.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this is a portion of our show where we decide if we think this movie was deep or if it needs to be cut. So Jacob, tell me kind of your ending thoughts with this movie.
So I think it's terribly unfortunate that I struggle so much to talk about things that I enjoy and have no end to words about things that I don't enjoy so much. Because I come away from a movie like this that it's almost a perfect storm for making it even difficult to discuss because of just, again, how loose it was, how bizarre it was. But I really, really appreciated it. I think that there is so much that you can talk about and analyze. And again, the way that it so perfectly captured that fairy tale feeling and so perfectly communicated its message while having an incomprehensible literal chronology. I think it deserves analysis on like an academic level to see how that this can be replicated in other stories. I know that it has been, but not in too terribly many of them. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I would say this is deep. It's almost literally the definition of deep in terms of there is a lot of meaning here that can be drawn out.
I'll agree. This movie is it's almost like every other werewolf movie, Little Red Riding Hood story, but this movie is hairy on the inside. So I will give it 3 out of 4 full moons. And I will say that it's also deep on the inside.
3 out of 4 full moons. I don't know. I can't help but just imagining a bunch of butts, man.
Yes.
Bunch of butts that are hairy on the inside.
Yep.
All right, we gotta. We can't take it anywhere after that.
All right, everyone, that's our episode this week. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you and your families have a wonderful Thanksgiving this year. We here at Deep Cuts of Horror are very appreciative and thankful of you every episode. If you enjoyed what you heard, please go ahead and like, subscribe, follow, give a comment, and share with everyone you know. We really appreciate that. We also love hearing your feedback, so go ahead, join in the conversation on our social medias and email. Our social medias are going to be at Deep Horror Pod across all platforms, and you can can email us your recommendations or let us know what you thought about the episode or the movies we've covered at deepcutsofhorror@gmail.com. Again, we love to hear from you guys, and we love to hear what you guys thought about the movie too, because it really helps inspire us and keep us going. Please make sure to listen next time where we're going to be covering Dave Made a Maze. But until next time, I hope you have a happy holiday and I hope you stay spooky.